Inside Paul Pena, two souls fought a lifelong war. One was the soul of the earth, a bluesman born from the pain and the mud of America. This soul wrote Jet Airliner, an anthem for the wanderer, a perfect rock and roll song. The other was the soul of the universe, a traveler of sound whose ears could hear across space and time. This soul heard a call from Siberia and mastered a mystical art thought impossible. And that war had no winner. The world murdered the soul of the earth by stealing its song. And the world ignored the soul of the universe by treating its gift as a curiosity. In the end, he was not a bridge. He was a battlefield where two geniuses destroyed each other. To understand the soul of Paul Pena's music, you have to travel back to the place where his two worlds collided. Our story begins on January 26, 1950, not in the Mississippi Delta or the gritty streets of Chicago, but in the salty, windswept air of Hyannis, Massachusetts, on the iconic peninsula of Cape Cod. In the post-war boom of the 1950s, this was a working-class community, a place where the quintessential American dream was pursued with calloused hands and resilient hearts. It was a melting pot, but for the Pena family, it was also a cultural outpost, a small island of an ancient heritage transplanted to the shores of the New World. That heritage came from a tiny volcanic archipelago off the coast of West Africa, the islands of Cape Verde. His parents, Jack and Virginia Pena, were both proud Americans of Cape Verdean descent. They were part of a wave of immigrants who had come to New England over generations, drawn by the promise of work in the tough, demanding fishing and shipping industries, and later in the sprawling cranberry bogs of the Cape. They brought with them more than just a willingness to work hard. They brought a culture forged in the crucible of the Atlantic, a unique Creole language blending Portuguese and African dialects, and a musical tradition that was the lifeblood of their community. Paul's father, Jack, was a gifted musician, a man whose hands knew both the grit of manual labor and the delicate grace of a guitar's fretboard. He was a master of the traditional string music of his homeland, an art form that was a living, breathing connection to the islands he and his ancestors had left behind. His mother, Virginia, was a talented singer who filled their modest home with melody. Music wasn't a luxury in the Pena household. It was a necessity. It was the language they spoke when words failed, their connection to the past, their comfort in the present, and their most precious gift to the future. That music was a sound called morna. To understand Paul Pena, you must first understand morna. It's a soulful, melancholic cousin to Portuguese fado, a music of profound longing and sweet nostalgia. Its lyrics speak of the sea, of separation, of the love for a distant homeland, and of a feeling so central to the Cape Verdean soul that it has its own word, saudade. It's an untranslatable term, a beautiful ache that encompasses nostalgia, longing, and a bittersweet melancholy for something or someone lost. Morna is the sound of saudade. It's the sound of the Atlantic Ocean itself, with all its vastness and its sorrow, captured in the gentle sway of a rhythm and the mournful cry of a guitar. It was this sound, this beautiful, sorrowful music, that was Paul Pena's first lullaby. It became the bedrock of his musical DNA, a foundation of complex, lilting rhythms, and a deep, soulful emotionality that would inform every note he would ever play. But from the very beginning, Paul's world was different. He was born with congenital glaucoma, a cruel and relentless condition that caused a catastrophic increase in pressure behind his eyes. The world, which should have been filled with the bright primary colors of a seaside town, the blue of the ocean, the white of the sails, the green of the marsh grass, was instead a fading impressionistic landscape. For Paul, reality was a blur of shadow and light, a world losing its definition before he could even properly learn its shape. By the time he was a toddler, his vision was almost completely gone. His family, people of modest means, explored every option. They considered surgery a daunting and expensive prospect. But the economic reality of their lives, the simple, hard truth of making a living week to week, made it an impossible dream. The darkness that descended upon him was not a temporary affliction, it was permanent. And so in the first years of his life, a profound and fundamental shift occurred. For a child who could not see, the world had to be reinterpreted. It had to be rebuilt, not with images, but with sounds. Sound became his light. Sound became his architecture. Sound became his only window to the world. His ears became his eyes, developing a sensitivity and an acuity that was nothing short of astonishing. His family tells stories of him as a 2-year-old, a tiny figure propped up near his father as Jack played the guitar. The boy would listen, his head cocked, and then, with an eerie precision, he would perfectly mimic the complex Morna melodies, singing them back with perfect pitch. He wasn't just hearing the music, he was absorbing it, visualizing it in his mind's eye, understanding its intricate structure and its deep emotional grammar in a way that sighted people, distracted by the visual world, never could. His blindness didn't just take away, it transformed. The world of sight was not erased, but rather channeled, its immense energy rerouted into the single supersensory organ of his hearing. His brain, denied the language of light, simply taught itself to see in the language of sound. In the tight-knit Cape Verdean community of Hyannis, a myth was beginning to form around him, that in exchange for the world of light, the gods had gifted the boy the entire kingdom of sound. In 1955, at the age of 5, Paul Pena's world expanded beyond the familiar sounds of his home and community. A journey was made from the comfortable Creole-inflected world of Cape Cod to the stately brick-lined streets of Watertown, a suburb of Boston. He was enrolled at the Perkins School for the Blind. This was not just any school. It was and is a legendary institution, a global leader in the education of the visually impaired. Its history was woven into the very fabric of the American story of overcoming adversity. It was the very place where, decades earlier, a determined teacher named Anne Sullivan had first connected with a young, feral girl named Helen Keller, unlocking her mind from the silent, dark prison of her disabilities. To attend Perkins was to become part of that legacy, a legacy of profound potential and human resilience. For Paul, Perkins was more than a school. It was a sanctuary. For the first time in his life, he was in a world that was built for him. He was no longer an anomaly, no longer the blind kid in a sighted world. He was surrounded by peers who shared his reality, by teachers who understood his challenges and, more importantly, his potential. It was a world where his blindness was not a deficit, but simply a shared human condition, a starting point from which to build a life. It was here that he was given the tools to truly navigate the world. He learned to read and write in Braille, the complex and elegant system of raised dots that would become his key to literacy, to knowledge, to the world of ideas. He was taught orientation and mobility skills, how to move with confidence through unseen spaces using a cane, how to build a detailed three-dimensional map of the world in his mind, a map made of sounds, textures, and echoes. But his most important, most transformative education took place in the music room. It was at Perkins that his raw, intuitive musical talent was given the gift of formal language. He was introduced to the intricate system of Braille music notation, a system even more complex than literary Braille, which allowed him to read musical scores with his fingertips. For a boy who had learned everything by ear, this was a revelation. It opened up the abstract world of musical theory, of harmony, of chord structures, of composition. He was no longer just feeling the music. He was now understanding its hidden architecture, its mathematical beauty. Around the age of 8, his world exploded once more. He picked up the guitar and the bass, and the theoretical knowledge he had been absorbing suddenly had a physical outlet. His progress was astonishing. The years he had spent deconstructing his father's Morna melodies had given him a deep, instinctual understanding of the fretboard. His fingers, already made incredibly sensitive by the daily practice of reading Braille, seemed to have an innate connection to the strings. He continued his relentless self-education. While his peers might have been listening to the wholesome sounds of Pat Boone, Paul was spending his nights huddled over his radio, tuned into the powerful broadcasts of WBZ in Boston. Through the static, a new sound came to him, a sound that would become the other great pillar of his musical identity. It was the electrifying, raw, and deeply human cry of the American blues, the sound of T-Bone Walker's sophisticated horn-like guitar lines, the raw power of Muddy Waters, and the stinging single-note eloquence of B.B. King. This was a revelation. In the blues, he heard a kindred spirit to the Morna of his father. It was another music born of struggle, of sorrow, of displacement, but also of profound resilience, defiance, and joy. It was the sound of another uprooted people, and it spoke to him on a cellular level. He began to fuse these two worlds in his mind and under his fingers, the melancholic, lilting rhythms of Cape Verde, beginning a long, slow dance with the 12-bar structure and bent notes of the American blues. By the age of 12, he was ready to share his gift. At a Perkins School talent show he took to the stage, he chose to perform the classic torch song, Stormy Weather. The story, which has become part of the school's folklore, is that when he opened his mouth to sing with a power, control, and emotional depth that was simply staggering for a boy his age, the room fell silent. He wasn't just a blind kid who could sing a song. He was a young artist, channeling a lifetime of unique experience, of darkness, of sound, of longing, into his performance. The applause that followed was more than just encouragement. It was a profound confirmation of his identity. He knew in that moment what he was. He was a musician. The 1960s were a time of cultural ferment, and just outside the sheltered walls of Perkins, the Boston area was the epicenter of the American folk and blues revival. Legendary Cambridge coffee houses like the Club 47 were hosting the new gods of folk, like a young Bob Dylan, alongside the old masters of the blues. For a prodigiously talented musician like Paul, it was a world that beckoned with an irresistible pull. From 1964 to 1967, he played in school bands, honing his craft, mastering the complex languages of blues and jazz, and beginning to write his own unique songs. When he graduated from Perkins in 1967, he was at a crossroads. He was a brilliant student, and a future in academia was a real possibility. But for him, there was no choice to be made. His path had been illuminated for him years before, not by light, but by sound. As he would later put it, with a simple, profound clarity that would define his entire existence. Music is my light. He packed his guitar, said goodbye to the sheltered world that had been his sanctuary, and stepped out into the smoky, mythic, and often unforgiving world of the professional bluesman. After leaving the structured, nurturing environment of Perkins, Paul Pena plunged headfirst into the vibrant, competitive, and electrifying music scene of late 1960s Boston and Cambridge. This was the era of the great American blues revival, a time when a new generation of young, often college-educated musicians were rediscovering and reinterpreting the raw, authentic sounds of the Delta in Chicago. The air was thick with artistic energy. Clubs like the Stablemates and the now legendary Club 47 were the scene's beating heart, places where folk purists, jazz cats, and blues aficionados gathered to hear living legends and the ambitious up-and-comers who hoped to one day join their ranks. Paul, still just a teenager, quickly began to make a name for himself. In a scene filled with talented musicians, he was a true anomaly. He was a blind musician of Cape Verdean heritage who could play the gut bucket blues with the authority and soul of a man twice his age who had been born and raised on the south side of Chicago. His style was a captivating, and to many an entirely new fusion of sounds. In his guitar playing, you could hear the clean, sophisticated, horn-like phrasing of his hero, T-Bone Walker, and the raw, emotional, string-bending vibrato of B.B. King. But underneath it all, there was something else, something that the other revivalists didn't have. It was the unique rhythmic sensibility of his Cape Verdean roots, a subtle, loping, almost syncopated quality that made his music swing and breathe in a way that was entirely his own. And then there was his voice. It was a powerful, expressive instrument, capable of a deep, resonant, worldly growl one moment and a soaring, soulful, almost tender cry the next. He became a fixture in the scene, a young gun who was deeply respected not as a novelty, but for his prodigious talent and his encyclopedic knowledge of the blues tradition. It was during this period, around 1969, that his path first crossed with another rising star of the Cambridge scene, a young, flame-haired slide guitarist and singer from a Quaker background named Bonnie Raitt. Raitt, then a student at Radcliffe, was a passionate and serious blues devotee. In Paul, she recognized a fellow old soul, an artist who didn't just play the blues, but who seemed to truly understand its deep emotional core. They would jam together in the late-night sessions that were the lifeblood of the scene, sharing stages and songs, forging a deep friendship and a musical partnership that would endure for the rest of his life. His reputation grew organically through word of mouth. The story of the incredible young blind guitarist spread through the tight-knit musician community. He was known for his astonishingly fluid and expressive slide guitar playing, a skill made all the more remarkable by his unconventional technique. He played with the guitar laid flat on his lap, a style he had developed to suit his own comfort and feel, allowing him to navigate the fretboard with an intuitive precision that baffled other players. This era was his true apprenticeship, his trial by fire. He was no longer a student at Perkins. He was a working musician, a journeyman bluesman earning his stripes night after night in smoky, crowded clubs, proving himself to tough audiences and to his often legendary peers. He was becoming a bridge between the old world of traditional blues and the new, folk-inflected sounds of the burgeoning singer-songwriter movement. But Boston, for all its creative energy, was a regional scene. Paul's talent was too big, too unique to be contained by one city, and a legendary, formidable figure from the wider music world, a man who built careers and created icons, was about to take notice. In 1971, the whispers about the blind blues prodigy from Cape Cod had traveled from the clubs of Boston all the way to the wooded rolling hills of Woodstock, New York. They had reached the ears of one of the most powerful and mythic figures in the entire music industry, Albert Grossman. Albert Grossman was not just a manager, he was a kingmaker. He was the brilliant, imposing, and often ruthless visionary who had guided the careers of Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin, the band, and Todd Rundgren. He was the architect of the folk rock revolution, a man who saw not just talent, but the cultural zeitgeist, and who knew how to bend it to his will. His record label, Bearsville Records, based in the creative haven of Woodstock, was a boutique label, a prestigious home for serious artists. To be signed by Grossman was to be anointed. It was a golden ticket, a promise of artistic freedom, critical respect, and commercial success. When Albert Grossman summoned Paul Pena to Woodstock, it must have felt like a dream come true. Here was the ultimate validation, the recognition from the very top of the industry that his unique talent was something special. He signed with Bearsville in 1971. In 1972, his debut album, the self-titled Paul Pena, was released. It was a solid, confident collection of blues rock songs that served as a powerful introduction to his artistry. It showcased his powerful, soulful voice, his tasteful, sophisticated guitar work, and his burgeoning songwriting skills. The album was met with positive reviews from the critics, who recognized him as a major new talent. One of its tracks, the soulful, upbeat Gonna Move, became a minor hit, earning significant airplay on blues and college radio stations across the country. For the first time, Paul's unique voice was reaching a national audience. It was a respectable debut, a solid foothold in the industry, but it was only a hint, a shadow of the masterpiece that was to come. In 1973, Paul went back into the Bearsville studio to record his second album. This time, everything clicked. The songs were stronger, the vision was clearer, his confidence was soaring. He was joined in the studio by a stellar cast of musicians, including the brilliant guitarist and his close collaborator, Benno Marcel. The album, which he titled New Train, was a quantum leap forward. It was an ambitious, brilliant, and deeply personal fusion of all his influences. There was hard-driving electric blues, gentle acoustic folk, soulful R&B ballads, and for the first time on a major recording, the unmistakable melodic and rhythmic inflections of his Cape Verdean heritage. The performances were electrifying, the production was warm and organic. It was the sound of an artist in full command of his powers, creating a work that was both timeless and years ahead of its time. And on that album was a song, a simple, infectious, forward-moving track about the universal feeling of travel, of restlessness, of leaving one life behind for the promise of another. It was a song born from the rhythms of the road, the hum of the tires, the feeling of motion. It was called Jet Airliner. Paul and the band knew they had created something special. New Train was their masterpiece, the culmination of Paul's entire musical journey up to that point. They delivered the master tapes to Albert Grossman, confident that they had a surefire hit on their hands, the record that would make Paul Pena the star he was always destined to be. And then nothing happened. Albert Grossman, in a decision that would become one of the most infamous and tragic what-ifs in the annals of music history, listened to the album and flatly refused to release it. The master tapes were shelved. The masterpiece was buried. The reasons have been debated and whispered about for decades. Grossman was a notorious perfectionist, a shrewd and often ruthless businessman. The official story is that he and Paul had a falling out over the final product, that Grossman felt the album, with its eclectic blend of styles, wasn't commercially viable. He couldn't fit it into a neat, marketable box, and Albert Grossman did not deal in things he couldn't sell. So, exercising the absolute power he held over his label and his artists, he locked the master tapes away in his vault. In a single, catastrophic act of commercial cowardice, Albert Grossman took a masterpiece, a living, breathing work of art, and turned it into a ghost. New Train was not shelved. It was murdered in its cradle. its brilliant light extinguished before a single soul outside the studio had a chance to see it. For Paul Pena, the blow was catastrophic. It wasn't just a disappointment, it was the derailment of his entire life. And the true horror was buried in the fine print of his contract. He was trapped. He was signed to a record label that refused to release his music, but he was also contractually forbidden from recording for anyone else until the terms of his deal were fulfilled. His masterpiece was buried, and his career was stopped dead in its tracks. The dream of Bearsville had become a prison. For the next few years, the story of Jet Airliner was just that, a ghost story, a legend whispered among musicians. But somehow, a demo version of the song, likely a rough mix from the new train sessions, found its way out of the Bearsville orbit. It was passed from hand to hand, a piece of secret, brilliant contraband. In 1976, that tape landed in the hands of Ben Sidran, a keyboardist who was working with the Steve Miller Band. Sidran played the demo for Steve Miller, who was in the process of recording his next album, Book of Dreams. Miller was instantly captivated. The song had an effortless, driving groove, a melody that was impossible to forget, and lyrics that perfectly captured the spirit of a touring rock band. It was the perfect road song. The Steve Miller Band recorded their own version, giving it a glossier, more arena rock-oriented production, but keeping the essential spirit, melody, and structure of Paul's original. In 1977, Jet Airliner was released as a single. It was an immediate, colossal global hit. It reached number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became an anthem, a permanent fixture on rock radio that endures to this day. For Paul Pena, it was a moment of the most beautiful and heartbreaking irony imaginable. The song that should have made him a star had done just that, but for someone else. While he did eventually begin to receive songwriting royalties, a bitter and prolonged dispute with his old label and management meant he never saw the full financial windfall he was so clearly owed. He was the invisible man behind one of the decade's biggest hits, his name a trivia question for die-hard music fans. While the world sang his anthem, Paul Pena was a ghost in his own machine, silenced by the industry he tried to conquer. His career, for all intents and purposes, was over, or so it seemed. For in the depths of that long creative exile, as the years stretched into a decade of obscurity, another sound was waiting for him. It wasn't a sound from the blues clubs of America or the recording studios of New York. It was a voice from the other side of the world, a secret whispered through the crackle and hiss of a shortwave radio. How does a man silenced by the machine find a new voice? The answer would be more improbable, more beautiful, and more transformative than anyone could have ever imagined. A hit song is a strange kind of ghost. For Steve Miller, Jet Airliner was a chart-topping, platinum-selling triumph that would define his career. But for Paul Pena, the song's true author, it was a constant, painful echo of a stolen future. It was the sound of his own soul, broadcast to the world through another man's voice. The success of the song did not lift him up. It deepened the shadows in which he was already lost. His masterpiece album, New Train, was a buried treasure, its existence a secret known only to a handful of industry insiders. The dream of Bearsville had curdled into a nightmare of contractual chains and creative silence. His career, for all intents and purposes, was over before it had truly begun. He had to escape. He had to find a place where the ghost of that song couldn't find him. After finally freeing himself from the legal shackles of his Bearsville contract, Paul Pena did not try to relaunch his career. The momentum was gone, the fire of his ambition dampened by the cold, hard reality of the industry. He left the creative crucible of the East Coast and drifted west, eventually settling in San Francisco. It was a city with a rich musical history of its own. But for Paul, it was also a place where he could disappear. He became a respected, if largely unknown, figure in the vibrant Bay Area blues scene. These were his wilderness years. He was no longer the rising star, the prodigy signed by the legendary Albert Grossman. He was a journeyman again, a local musician playing for the love of the music and for the necessity of paying the rent. He played gigs when he could in small, smoky blues clubs where the audiences were more interested in the authenticity of a guitar lick than the gloss of a hit record. He continued to collaborate with his old friend Bonnie Raitt and other musicians who revered his talent, but these were fleeting moments of light in a long period of creative exile. To be a musician's musician is a special kind of purgatory. It means you are deeply respected by your peers, the people who truly understand the depth of your craft. But it also often means you are completely invisible to the wider world. Paul was a quiet legend, a secret hero to those in the know. But to the millions of people singing along to Jet Airliner on the radio, he was a ghost. He was a man living with the constant, surreal irony of being the architect of a sound that had defined the decade while he himself was struggling to get by. The years stretched on. The 1970s bled into the 1980s. The musical landscape changed again and again. Disco rose and fell. Punk exploded and fizzled. New wave came and went. And through it all, Paul Pena remained a constant, quiet presence in the Bay Area, playing the timeless, deeply human music that was his only truth. But inside, a profound silence was growing. The fire that had driven him to create New Train had been reduced to an ember. His health began to decline. The early signs of the diabetes and chronic pancreatitis that would plague his later years starting to appear. It would have been so easy for him to fade away completely, another tragic story of a brilliant artist broken by a system that had celebrated his art while discarding him. He could have become a bitter man, consumed by the ghost of what might have been. But then one night in 1984, alone in the darkness of his San Francisco apartment, something extraordinary happened. A sound came to him from the other side of the world, a sound that would not just reignite his creative spirit, but would change the course of his life and set him on the most improbable journey imaginable. Paul Pena was a lifelong sonic explorer. His blindness had made him a connoisseur of sound, and his shortwave radio was his vessel for navigating the globe. It was a habit he had kept since his childhood at Perkins, a way of traveling the world through the crackle and hiss of transcontinental signals. He would spend hours in the dead of night, his ear pressed to the speaker, slowly turning the dial, searching for new sounds, new languages, new melodies from distant lands. One night, as he was scanning the frequencies, he stumbled upon a broadcast from what was then Radio Moscow, the international broadcasting service of the Soviet Union. And then he heard it, a sound so strange, so powerful, so completely otherworldly, that it seemed to defy all the known laws of human vocalization. It was the sound of his own mind made audible, a single source producing a universe of textures, a low resonant drone that was the foundation, the architecture, the very ground of being, and a high whistling melody that was the soul, the bird, the free spirit soaring above it. For a man who built his entire world out of sound, this was not music. It was a blueprint of creation. Paul was mesmerized. He was transfixed. He had spent his entire life studying sound, from the intricate polyrhythms of Morna to the complex harmonies of jazz, but this was something entirely new, something that felt both ancient and alien. He had no idea what it was or where it came from. For years it became his holy grail. He would hunt the shortwave bands night after night, hoping to catch another fleeting broadcast of this mysterious, otherworldly music. Finally, in 1991, a breakthrough. A friend, knowing of his obsession, gave him an album of field recordings. The album was from a remote, little-known, semi-autonomous republic in the heart of Central Asia, a place most of the world had never heard of, nestled between the vastness of Siberia and the steppes of Mongolia, the Republic of Tuva. Paul put the record on, and there it was, the sound. He learned that it was an ancient art form called sume, or, as it's more commonly known, throat singing. For Paul Pena, a man who had built his entire world out of sound, this was the ultimate challenge. A new, all-consuming obsession was born. With the same relentless dedication and obsessive focus he had applied to learning the blues, as a boy, he set about teaching himself how to throat sing. It was an almost impossible task. He had no teacher. There were no instructional videos he could watch, no diagrams he could see. He had only a recording, his own phenomenal ear, an ear that could hear nuances and overtones that most people couldn't even perceive, and his own body. It was a process of pure, blind, auditory reverse engineering. He would listen to the tapes for hours on end, slowing them down, trying to isolate the frequencies. He would sit in his chair, his hands on his chest and throat, feeling the subtle vibrations, trying to manipulate his own vocal cords, his own larynx, his own resonating chambers to replicate the impossible sounds. It must have been a frustrating, painstaking process, a series of trial and error in the dark. But slowly, miraculously, he began to unlock the secret. He figured it out. The blind American bluesman from Cape Cod taught himself the ancient, mystical art of Tuvan throat singing. But his fascination was more than just a musical or technical curiosity. The more he learned about the music, the more he wanted to learn about the people who made it. He researched Tuvan culture, their history as nomadic horsemen, their deep spiritual, almost pantheistic reverence for the natural world. In their music, which often mimicked the sounds of the wind, the water, and the animals of the steppe, he heard a profound connection to the earth that resonated deeply with his own blues sensibilities. He felt a kinship with these people from the other side of the globe. They were outsiders, a tiny, unique culture, preserving its ancient traditions against the overwhelming force of the modern, globalized world. In their story of cultural resilience, he saw a powerful reflection of his own life, the story of a Cape Verdean kid preserving the Morna of his father, the story of a bluesman preserving a tradition in the face of changing musical fashions. He wasn't just learning a technique, he was connecting with a soul. Word of this strange and brilliant American bluesman who had mastered their ancient art began to travel through the small, interconnected world of ethnomusicologists and world music enthusiasts. In 1993, a group of Tuvan musicians, including the legendary throat singer Kongar Ol Ondar, were on tour in the United States and performed a concert in San Francisco. Paul was in the audience. After the show, he went backstage and, with the help of an interpreter, he introduced himself, and then, to the utter astonishment of the visiting singers, he demonstrated his skills. Imagine their shock. Here, on the other side of the world, was this large, blind American man, sitting in a wheelchair, who opened his mouth and produced the authentic, powerful, and deeply resonant drone of Kargaira, one of the deepest and most difficult styles of throat singing, a sound that most Tuvans spend a lifetime perfecting. They were so impressed, so deeply moved by his passion and his respect for their culture, that they made him an offer that would change his life. They invited him to the ultimate event in their world, the Triennial International Kume Symposium in Kizil, the capital of Tuva. In 1995, Paul Pena, accompanied by the makers of a documentary film who had caught wind of this incredible story, embarked on the journey of a lifetime. The trip, which would be beautifully chronicled in the 1999 Oscar-nominated film Genghis Blues, was a profound and beautiful homecoming for a man who had never been there before. For Paul, who was now in seriously failing health and often confined to a wheelchair due to his diabetes, a trip to one of the most remote and inaccessible places on earth was a monumental, almost Herculean undertaking. It was a journey into the unknown, a leap of faith into a world he had only ever experienced through the crackle of a shortwave radio. When he finally arrived in Tuva, after a grueling journey across continents, something remarkable happened. The man who had been a forgotten footnote in his own country was welcomed as a hero. The Tuvan people were astonished and deeply touched that this American, this outsider from a world away, had taken the time and shown the profound respect to learn their most sacred and difficult musical tradition. In this remote, windswept land, he was not a forgotten bluesman. He was a cultural icon. He competed in the singing competition, an honored guest among the masters of the art. When he took to the stage and unleashed his powerful bass-heavy version of a Tuvan classic, the audience was stunned into silence, then erupted in applause. They gave him a Tuvan nickname, a name of great honor, Sher Shimjer, which translates to earthquake, a tribute to the sheer, resonant power of his voice that seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. He won first prize in the Kargira category and became a beloved champion of the Tuvan people. For Paul, the experience was a profound rebirth. In the heart of Siberia, on the steppes of Central Asia, he had found a new voice, a new purpose, and a new artistic community that embraced him without reservation. The man who had been silenced and made invisible by his own industry had found a new global stage. He had become an unlikely and beautiful bridge between two disparate worlds. The climax of his journey was a performance that symbolized his entire life's work. In a concert hall in Kizil, accompanied by the greatest living Tuvan masters, Paul Pena sang the blues. In that moment, the soulful, melancholic cry of the American blues, born from the struggle of African Americans in the Mississippi Delta, met the ancient earth-shaking drone of the Tuvan steppes. The musical traditions of two cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, found a moment of perfect, sublime harmony in the voice of one blind man from Cape Cod. It was more than a concert, it was a profound act of cultural communion, a testament to the universal power of music to transcend all borders, all languages, and all darkness. The man who had been invisible in his own culture had finally truly been seen. The journey to Tuva was a personal and spiritual triumph for Paul Pena, but it also had a profound and unexpected professional consequence. The documentary film chronicling his adventure, Genghis Blues, was completed in 1999 and became a surprise hit on the film festival circuit. Its infectious spirit, its beautiful music, and the undeniable charisma of its central character captivated audiences. In 2000, in a turn of events that was every bit as improbable as Paul's journey itself, the film was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. Suddenly, Paul Pena was no longer a forgotten footnote. His name was in the newspapers. His story was on television. The Oscar nomination shone a long overdue international spotlight on this brilliant, neglected artist. For the first time, a wide audience was learning his name and hearing his incredible story. The film's success created a new wave of interest in his music, and it gave his old loyal friends Bonnie Raitt and Steve Miller the leverage they had been waiting for. For years, they had championed his cause, trying to convince the various record labels that had acquired the Bearsville catalog to right a historical wrong. Now, with the world finally paying attention, their voices were heard, the vaults were opened, and in the year 2000, nearly 27 years after it was recorded and unceremoniously buried, the album New Train was finally released to the public. Listening to it was like opening a time capsule. The music sounded as fresh, as vibrant, and as stunningly innovative as it must have in 1973. It was a brilliant, soulful, and deeply moving record, the work of a master at the absolute peak of his powers. It was a ghost finally given flesh, a silent masterpiece finally allowed to sing. The release was a moment of profound, if bittersweet, vindication for Paul. The album received widespread, ecstatic critical acclaim. It was hailed as a lost classic, a buried treasure of American music. It even went on to earn a prestigious W.C. Handy Award nomination, the blues equivalent of a Grammy. The train that had been stuck in the station for almost 3 decades, the train that had carried his dreams, had finally, at long last, arrived at its destination. This final late career triumph, however, was set against a somber backdrop of declining health. The years of struggle, poverty, and inadequate medical care had taken a severe toll. The diabetes and chronic pancreatitis that had been diagnosed in the early 90s had become chronic and debilitating. He spent his final years in a wheelchair, his once powerful body weakened by a constant battle with illness. Yet, his spirit remained undimmed. The release of New Train and the success of Genghis Blues had given him a final, beautiful encore. He continued to perform when his health allowed, his voice, though weathered by time and illness, still a powerful and deeply expressive instrument. His passion for music, his light in the darkness, remained as fierce as ever. He was no longer a ghost. He was a celebrated artist, his story a source of inspiration for a new generation. But his victory was to be short-lived. On October 1st, 2005, at his home in San Francisco, Paul Pena passed away from complications of diabetes and pancreatitis. He was 55 years old. The man who had overcome blindness, who had survived the crushing indifference of the music industry, and who had found his voice in one of the most remote corners of the earth, was finally silenced. The man who had lived his life in the dark had found his own kind of brilliant, improbable light, but his time in it was tragically, heartbreakingly brief. The journey was complete. The buried train had finally arrived at the station, and the man who conducted it had reached his final destination. His life, a song of profound sorrow and astonishing triumph, had ended. But the echo of his voice and the meaning of his extraordinary journey was just beginning to be truly heard. So how do we measure the legacy of a man like Paul Pena? What is the lasting significance of a life lived almost entirely in sound? A journey that took him from the darkness of blindness to the heart of Siberia? It's a legacy not found in chart positions or record sales, but in the quiet, powerful ripples he left behind. The passing of Paul Pena was not a thunderclap. It was a deep, resonant hum felt most profoundly by those who had been closest to his unique musical orbit. He had spent most of his life as a ghost in the machine of the music industry, but in death, the story of his incredible life was just beginning to be heard. How do we measure the legacy of a man whose greatest triumphs were secrets? And what becomes of a voice that was buried for so long, only to be discovered just before it was extinguished forever? The news of Paul Pena's death spread not like a wildfire, but like a slow glowing ember passed from hand to hand within the communities that had cherished him. In the world of mainstream rock, it was a minor note, a sad postscript to the story of Jet Airliner. But in the world of the blues, in the burgeoning community of world music enthusiasts, and in the hallowed halls of the Perkins School for the Blind, the sense of loss was immense and deeply personal. The first and most powerful tributes came from the musicians who had always been his champions, the ones who had seen his genius long before the world was ready. His lifelong friend, Bonnie Raitt, spoke of him not just as a brilliant musician, but as a national treasure, a man whose spirit was as powerful as his voice. Steve Miller, the man whose career had been so profoundly impacted by Paul's creation, made it a mission to ensure his name would not be forgotten. In their concerts, they would often perform Jet Airliner together, and they would always take a moment to tell the story. They would introduce the song not as their hit, but as the creation of a brilliant blind bluesman from Cape Cod, a man whose masterpiece had been locked away. For hundreds of thousands of rock fans, this was the first time they were hearing the name Paul Pena, the first time they were learning the secret history of a song they had known their entire lives. But perhaps the most powerful and enduring tribute was the one that chronicled his most improbable adventure. The documentary Genghis Blues became his definitive legacy. After his death, the film took on a new life, becoming a beloved cult classic, passed among music lovers and aspiring documentarians as a perfect example of a story almost too incredible to be true. It was the film that allowed the world to finally see Paul Pena, not as a tragic figure, but as a man of infectious joy, brilliant intellect, and an indomitable spirit. It captured his hearty laugh, the way his face would light up when he talked about music, and the sheer, unadulterated passion that drove him. The film ensured that he would be remembered not for the darkness he was born into, but for the brilliant, improbable light he found on the other side of the world. His passing was also deeply mourned in a place most of his American fans couldn't find on a map. In the Republic of Tuva, the news of the death of Sher Shimger, the earthquake, was received with genuine sorrow. He was more than just a visiting musician to them. He was a brother, an honored member of their community who had shown their ancient culture a profound and unexpected respect. His journey had forged a lasting bond, a strange and beautiful bridge between a tiny Siberian republic and the world of the American blues. Back in America at the Perkins School for the Blind, his alma mater, his story became a cornerstone of their legacy. He was no longer just a talented former student. He was an icon, a symbol of the school's highest ideals. His life became a powerful lesson for a new generation of visually impaired students, a testament to the idea that a disability is not a barrier, but can in fact be the very source of one's unique power and vision. He was proof that the only true limitations are the ones we place on ourselves. To fully grasp the weight of Paul Pena's story, we must confront the two central pillars of his life: the tragedy of his professional career and the triumph of his inner vision. The tragedy was a quiet one, born from a music industry's failure of vision. His masterpiece album, New Train, a fusion of genres decades ahead of its time, was shelved by his manager Albert Grossman, who simply couldn't hear the future. From this decision came the ghost that haunted him, his song, Jet Airliner. While its royalties were a lifeline, hearing his own creation become a global anthem for someone else was a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the artist he should have been. But Paul Pena's legacy transcends that ghost. It is found in the triumph of turning a perceived limitation into a superpower. From the moment his sight faded, his brain rewired itself, dedicating its pathways to the world of sound. This wasn't just poetry. It was a neurological reality that gave him an almost unimaginable sense of hearing. This heightened acuity was the key to his genius, allowing him to deconstruct the complex morna of his father, master the solos of B.B. King from a crackly radio, and, most astonishingly, unlock the ancient secrets of Tuvan throat singing by ear alone. Denied mainstream success, Paul became an improbable pioneer. The very act that silenced his career set him on the path to his greatest discovery. He sought a deeper connection in sound itself, and in doing so, built bridges that others could not even imagine. He forged a link between the morna of his ancestors and the blues of his nation, and then, most remarkably, between the soul of the Mississippi Delta and the ancient steppes of Siberia, proving music is a universal language that transcends all borders. Ultimately, Paul Pena's legacy is not the cautionary tale of a broken industry, but a profound testament to the alchemy of the human spirit. His life is the ultimate proof that our greatest perceived limitations can be the source of our most unique and powerful vision. He was a blind man who taught the world to listen, reminding us all that the deepest truths are not seen with the eyes but are heard and felt with the heart.